Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at how to realign an Erie 2400 series valve body that's gone out of alignment, and also how to inspect and replace the seal disc. So if you've got water flowing through the drain line here when the valve is in service mode, that could be an indication that the valve has gone out of alignment or that you've got a worn seal disc. Water should only flow through the drain line when the valve is performing one or other of its 3 regeneration cycles. So the first thing to do is to make sure that the valve is actually in service mode. Before you go any further, you're going to want to disconnect the power, turn off the water supply, and release the pressure in the system by opening a cold tap. And in the next part of the video you might notice that I've taken the valve off the vessel and I've also removed the valve front. But that's just to make it easier for me to show you the parts of the valve that are relevant to this job. And I'm imagining that your valve will still be attached to the vessel and that the valve front will still be attached also. So the first thing you're going to need to do is to remove the 6 bolts that hold on the valve cover. Once you've done that, the valve cover can be lifted off, and it's probable that it will bring some of the internal components with it. But if it doesn't, just pick them out until what you can see is this green disc, which is the seal disc. When these vanes on top of the seal disc get worn or scratched, the seal disc can no longer make a good seal with the rotor plate. So water starts going to parts of the valve where it shouldn't be, and that's when you start getting things like the valve running to drain when in service mode. The seal disc can easily be removed with a pair of pliers, and the rest of the components should stay in place, but if they don't, please refer to the video about rebuilding a stripped down Erie 2400 series valve. So now it's time to rebuild the valve, starting of course with the new seal disc, and there's a locating lug just here. So find the little indent on the underneath of the seal disc and line that up with the locating lug. Drop the seal disc on and just give it a little press down. Next comes the rotor plate, which obviously goes smooth side down, and as long as these 2 holes and these 2 holes line up, it doesn't matter which way round that goes. Then comes the rotor cam, which has this figure of 8 pattern on the underneath, and that contains a rubber seal, so just make sure the rubber seal is still there. It doesn't normally come out. And the rotor plate has the same figure of 8 pattern in it, which actually slots in to that channel on the underneath of the rotor cam. So line those up and give it a press down. And next comes the worm gear, and this is part of the realignment part of the process, because the worm gear has 2 arrows on its upper side, and one of these arrows must end up lining up with the second tooth here on the worm drive shaft. Now it's all one tooth really because it's a spiral, but if we can imagine for a moment that that represents the second tooth on the worm drive shaft, then one of the arrows on the worm gear needs to end up lining up with that second tooth, like that. Next comes the polyethylene washer, which just drops over the top of the rotor cam like that. And finally, the valve cover. Inside the top of the valve cover you will find this Teflon washer, although sometimes you'll find that the Teflon washer has remained in place here on top of the rotor cam. But as long as it's either here or inside the valve cover, that's fine. And the valve cover will only fit on one way round. So just line it up, give it a little press down, and then it's just a matter of replacing the 6 bolts. But when you're tightening the 6 bolts, it's a good idea to do them in opposite pairs. So for instance, you might start by tightening these 2, then move on to these 2, then move on to these 2, and repeat that pattern until they're all tight. So now that everything's been put back together, turn the water back on, and there should now be no water escaping from the valve via the drain line with the valve in service mode. But that's not the end of the process, because now we need to initiate a manual regen, and on this valve I can do that by just pressing the scroll button once, but depending on the age of your valve it may be that you have to press and hold the scroll button or repeatedly press the scroll button. But anyway, the idea is to initiate a manual regen. You don't need to let the valve complete each cycle of regeneration. You can advance through the cycles by pressing the scroll button again. And again. And again. Once the valve has completed all 3 of its regeneration cycles and is now back in service mode, check once again to see whether water is still running to drain. It can be useful at this point to take the drain line off the drain elbow, so as not to confuse water running to drain with water that's just left over in the drain line. If water has now stopped running to drain with the valve in service mode, the fix has been successful. Otherwise, there are still a few steps to be taken. The first of which is to take the valve front off by removing the 2 retaining screws, and the valve front should then just pull away. The end of the worm drive shaft is D-shaped, so it has this flat portion to it here. Next, note the position of the D-shaped end of the worm drive shaft here. Take a note of which direction this flat portion is pointing. So in this instance the flat portion is pointing in that direction. In other words, let's say 25 past the hour. Now take a pair of pliers and turn the end of the worm drive shaft through one complete turn anti-clockwise. If water is still coming out of the drain, now turn it through 2 turns anti-clockwise. And if water is still coming out, 3 turns anti-clockwise. And so on until there's no longer any water coming out through the drain. So all that remains to be done now is to replace the valve front, and this is one of the reasons it was important to note the position of the flat portion on the end of the worm drive shaft, so as it will now hopefully be still in the correct position to line up with the hole in the coupling on the valve front. So offer the coupling over the end of the worm drive shaft and just pop the 2 retaining screws back in, and that should be it.